Redshift here, doing my part to shift perceptions out of the pink and into the red. Okay, so I recently found this YouTube channel called Chomsky's Philosophy, and it has many playlists, each full of lots of videos of Noam Chomsky speaking, each playlist having its own topic, of course. So I watched a few Chomsky videos before finding the Chomsky's Philosophy channel, and then I watched about 4 or 5 videos on the postmodernism playlist of the channel. In one of the videos, I watched Chomsky, and in one of the videos I watched, Chomsky said that one of the arguments that slave owners used in the past was that they were more moral than the industrial capitalists who paid people wages for working, and the argument went like this. The slave owners owned their slaves, and therefore took good care of them, but the northerners who had people working in their factories were renting their slaves, and therefore did not take good care of them. I agree with Noam Chomsky's assessment that there is some truth to this, but that we should not agree with slavery, but we should instead criticize wage slavery. Then either in another video or the same video, he was talking with like 3 other people, 2 men and 1 woman, and they would like ask him a question, one of them would, and then, or bring an intellectual disagreement to him, and then Chomsky would give a detailed answer while they listened. And Chomsky said that humanity seems to be slowly progressing by delving deeper into its own values, such as tolerance, such as how we now tolerate homosexuality. But I have a few criticisms of this viewpoint. Number 1, we did not come to an acceptance of homosexuality on our own. We had tons of pro-homosexuality propaganda shoved down our throats since at least the 1990s, if not even earlier. It's only after years and years of propaganda that they have managed to change the public's view of homosexuality from that of viewing it as being something that should be heavily suppressed to viewing it as being something that people should have a live and let live attitude toward. Number 2, the change to acceptance of homosexuality has not been a very long experiment. It may very well be the case that we will discover in 20 or 50 or 100 years that acceptance of homosexuality was as bad of an idea as giving equal rights to women was. Because we have different biology, we have different values, different capabilities, etc. We are now seeing what a horrible idea it was to give women the vote and give women equal rights. We will probably see the same thing about homosexuality later on down the line. Chomsky seems to be assuming that all human beings are the same, and that therefore there cannot possibly be any negative consequences that come from giving women equal rights and giving homosexuals equal rights. This is a foolish assumption. The kind of tolerance we have toward women and homosexuals is based on the high-tech society which produces way more food, uses oil, and thereby allows us to use up the planet's limited natural resources to do far more work than we would otherwise be able to do, such as transporting ourselves long distances in a short amount of time and with little effort and little expense, such as we do with cars. In other words, we think that allowing women equal rights and tolerating homosexuality is a good thing, but that's only because we have a much wider margin for error in society these days. In other words, high technology and using up the world's oil is temporarily allowing us to be able to afford inefficiencies and corruptions that we would never have been able to tolerate throughout all of human history before, because before in human history, the margin for error was way smaller. And with the increasing popularity of MGTOW, we will soon see men forcing a tapering of the Ponzi scheme known as debt-based currency, known as insane government spending. This tapering will cause the whole house of cards to collapse, because you can't taper a Ponzi scheme. And when you try to taper a Ponzi scheme, the Ponzi scheme collapses. And the US dollar and the debt-based fiat currency that the Federal Reserve puts out and the petrodollar, this whole thing, this entity, this complicated put-together entity with many facets, this thing is, it is a Ponzi scheme. And when we force the tapering of it, it will collapse. As, MGTOW is going to force. It's going to force a tapering of the Ponzi scheme as MGTOW gets more and more popular. And then at least hopefully we will have a return to more sane standards after that, such as sound money and no subsidization of female so-called equality. Females and everyone else will have to sink or swim on their own, instead of being subsidized by male taxpayers in the form of welfare. When we abolish government, we will see homosexuals become a lot more traditionalist. Their numbers will also stop growing so fast because men and women will keep their kids from being molested, and thus far fewer people will end up homosexual. A very large percentage of homosexuals are homosexual because they were sexually molested as children. So once we overthrow the government and give people power over their kids again, hardly any kids will get molested, and then there will be hardly any kids growing up to be homosexual anymore. And then, homosexuality will stop spreading, and it will eventually, I don't want to say completely die off, but it will shrink again, right? Women will voluntarily surrender their freedom to a man in exchange for protection, food, shelter, clothes, medicine, etc., and kids. And thus we will see that women do not actually want equality. Women only quote-unquote want equality when they are brainwashed from birth with tons of feminist indoctrination, and when they are furthermore given a safety net by government and a subsidy in the form of misandric laws and preferences in terms of hiring and other such things. But when all that crap is removed, then we will see that probably at least 95% of women, maybe 99% of women, or even maybe more than that, of women, maybe 99.9% of women, do not want freedom or equality. That's what we're going to see after government is abolished and or radically shrunk and all the misandric laws are gone and there's no more welfare and all the rest of it. When all that crap is gone, we're going to see that almost all women do not want freedom or equality. What women actually want is to be taken care of and allowed to have children who they get to raise in a comfortable and safe environment. Then we will see how ridiculous the whole idea of female equality actually is. So Chomsky's whole idea about the slow progress toward tolerance and freedom, at least for so-called oppressed people, is actually quite delusional. And not only that, but the real forms of oppression that we, the 99.9% of people, suffer from are actually getting worse, such as propaganda, which is increasing in ubiquity and in sophistication. Propaganda is becoming more and more subtle, harder and harder to detect. I have an above-average IQ, and I keep my eye sharply focused on perceiving all the propaganda that is presented to my eye, and yet I still do not always perceive it. Sometimes when I do perceive it, it takes me seeing a commercial like 10 or 20 times, or maybe more, before I realize that, oh my god, this commercial is propaganda, and this is how it works, this is what it's trying to say. And maybe I was a little suspicious of the commercial before, but I really couldn't see how it was propaganda, even though I suspected it. So it might, sometimes takes me a long time to figure it out. So imagine just a person with 100 IQ who doesn't even care or doesn't even know that they should be looking out for propaganda and everything. They're never going to see it. So it's just terrifying. This form of tyranny, this mental enslavement, which leads to, people doing wrong actions, not morally wrong actions, but the wrong actions in that they don't hold the government accountable and or they save in fiat currency and things like this. This all happens because of the control of their minds that the government has. And the government controls people's minds with propaganda. So the propaganda is one of the root issues, one of the absolute root issues. You could almost say that propaganda is a more root issue than fiat currency, which is really the root issue. And because the reason fiat currency is not ended, and the reason it keeps being a problem that just persists, is because of the propaganda brainwashing people into not realizing that fiat currency is a huge problem and that sound money is way, 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 way better. You see? Not just better, infinitely better, pretty much. So propaganda is one of the absolute root problems. It is terrifying, and I don't know how to end it other than, the people becoming so poor because of the incompetence of the elites and the incompetence and greed of the elites and the government, so that, everybody gets so poor they can't even afford rent and food anymore, and then the people violently revolt and overthrow the government. That's almost the only solution I can see. Because how do you overcome propaganda when people they're not even smart enough to see that it's propaganda, and even if you point it out to them, they'll think that you're just reading into it. Like you're just seeing something that's not there, you're just a conspiracy theorist. No, I'm not. CIA has been studying mind control ever since the MK Ultra program in like the 1950s. So, which, the MK Ultra program ran from 1953 to 73. And I'm sure they started other programs to continue on with the successful aspects of MK Ultra. So, what I'm saying is not conspiracy theorist at all, really. Just because it's not proven doesn't mean it's not 100% plausible and even, logical and probable. So, I have an above average IQ, but I keep my mind out, but yet I keep my eye out for propaganda, but it takes me seeing a commercial sometimes a few dozen times before I realize that it's propaganda and what idea or belief it's trying to inculcate in the viewer, often by way of an intimation. That's the really terrifying part. They don't even explicitly... Propaganda is becoming subtler and subtler to where all it does is imply what it's trying to convince you of. And not even imply it like in a direct way, but like imply it like it's implying the implication. Like, you know what I mean? Like a game of telephone, right? Like, it's not even directly implying it. It's implying something else that implies what they're trying to get you to believe. So it's really hard to see, right? Of course, I know Chomsky is aware of propaganda as well, so perhaps this is not a fair criticism to level against him, but it really does seem to me that it is entirely debatable whether humanity has made any progress at all, other than technological progress, of course. People these days often have less free time than people in the past did. While we may not do physical labor the way people of the past did, we do still work, and we do still work insanely long hours compared to how long we should need to work if we had honest money and such. In one of the Chomsky videos, I watched Chomsky mention that he did a talk, and after it, a woman said, I'm not sure whether it was to him or to his friend who told him about it, but a woman had said that Chomsky's view was naive because of two things. I can't remember what one of them was, but the other one was Chomsky is assuming that people act morally, right? And I agree with this woman. You know, Chomsky's view is naive, and he is assuming that people act morally, and his view is wrong, because people often don't act morally, even if it's only a small percentage of the population. This is why Marxist offshoots of government do not work. People do not act morally. This is why Bitcoin works, because it assumes that no one is trustworthy, and it is engineered to work despite the fact that every single person using it may well be highly dishonest and untrustworthy. Chomsky's view of the Federal Reserve, according to one video that I saw, is that each country needs a central bank, and that what we should be doing is having the government print up money and, if I understood him correctly, then use that money to pay people to do necessary work that needs to be done and which no one is doing despite the fact that it needs to be done and despite the fact that there are millions of people out of work. This might be a good idea. It sounds to me like it's similar to what I think Hitler did in Germany, which created an economic miracle that turned Germany from an economic and social hellhole of hyperinflation and mass prostitution into a country with the highest standard of living in Europe at the time. But the problem with this technique of government printing up money and then using it to do good and important things is that it requires an efficient and trustworthy government. But the government is power, and power attracts evil, power-hungry people, and therefore the power structure, i.e. government, becomes corrupt, and then cannot use such an economic system to help the people and make society run well and advance technology quickly. Chomsky's method assumes that government can be trusted to do what is humane and sane and morally wise and correct. But governments do not want to do that at all. Governments are evil. Our founding fathers were very clear that they considered government an evil, a necessary evil, but an evil nonetheless. An evil which must be chained down as much as possible so that it will never have the power to oppress the people, which is what the Bill of Rights was. It was the chains preventing the government from violating the natural God-given rights of the people of the country. And the Founding Fathers also wanted us to avoid foreign wars, thereby preventing us from not only harming people of other countries who have not attacked us, but also preventing us from going off the gold standard and onto a fiat currency system, because fiat currency systems are good for funding war at the expense of the people of the country waging the war. Sound money equals little or no war, and a prosperous middle class. Fiat currency equals lots of war and an impoverished middle class. So Chomsky's trust of government to use the power of fiat currency for good instead of evil is extremely naive and foolish. The government cannot be trusted. Governments and corporations can never be trusted, and thus we must put the power in the hands of the people. And one way to do this is to have everyone in the country use sound money to pay for things, and especially to save their wealth in, because when a government uses fiat currency, it can inflate the currency all it wants, but it is only stealing purchasing power from the holders of fiat currency, not from the holders of sound money. And the propaganda is funded by fiat currency, and efforts at quote-unquote equality, which is really just a distortion of reality, because people are not equal, races are not equal, the genders are not equal, the rich and the poor's education levels are not equal. So this, equality is really just a distortion of reality. And it's also funded by fiat currency. And thus the very things that undermine the power of the people by both weakening the people's ability and or willingness to hold the government accountable, as well as by propping up the members of the society who are inferior, such as women, are the very things that the fiat currency that Noam Chomsky is in favor of actually promotes. So while Chomsky is not in favor of the consent of the people being manufactured, he is in favor of the tool that the government uses to fund that propaganda which manufactures the consent of the people. So Chomsky's position is actually highly self-contradictory, at least from what I've heard of his position. I mean, I'm going to continue learning more about his views, so maybe I'm wrong, maybe he's not as inconsistent as I think he is, or self-contradictory as I think he is, but this is how it seems to me right now. I think Chomsky's main weakness is his naivete. He wants freedom for everyone, and yet I think that he does not realize that government cannot be trusted, and he does not realize that it is far better to leave the extra money in the hands of the people who earned it, rather than allow government to steal it by way of money printing, and then let government decide what to do with it, which will usually be a bad decision, right? Because the government doesn't value the money because they didn't earn it, right? Plus, it's basic psychology. Those who earned the money know its value because they had to suffer to get it. those who had, and even if they didn't have to suffer to get it, they at least had to waste some of their life to accrue that money. They didn't just get the money instantly. It took some time for them to get that money, even if it's only, earning interest on, the money they have in the bank, which may be a lot, or, getting passive income from properties they rent out to other people. Even if they didn't really have to earn the money, they still had to, expend some of their lifetime, some of the years or months of their life to get that money, right? So even then, the money does represent some of their life itself, which is an incalculably valuable property, right? Like, time is the one resource you cannot buy back, right? So, it's basic human psychology that those who earn money know its value because they had to suffer to get that money, while those who easily acquire money with no effort, such as government acquiring purchasing power through money printing, those kind of people are not going to appreciate the value of the money, and they're going to end up wasting it because they didn't value it, because they didn't earn it with their own work or their own life energy or whatever, right? So it's always better to have honest money than it is to have fiat currency. Who knows? While Hitler did his best to take care of Germany and then later to get out of the war, and while he did many great things for Germany before the start of World War II, perhaps the war would never have happened if Hitler had put the country on sound money, because then he would not have been able to fund the war. But then again, I believe that one of the reasons Hitler used the socialist economic stimulation method that he did was because of the lack of sound money to use. You cannot put your country on an honest money system if there's no honest money in the country, and if the other countries are unwilling to work with you in putting your country on a gold standard because they are hoarding the gold in order to bring your country to its knees. So I think Hitler did the best that he could. But still, sound money is always best. Sound money is still better than having a virtuous dictator running your country, which, by the way, a virtuous dictator is the next best setup after anarcho-capitalism. Right? But in the future, it will be better because a country will be able to create its own cryptocurrency and base it on anything. Lumber, steel, rhodium, oil, or whatever else it wants. And so a lack of gold will not be a problem in putting a country on an honest money standard in the future, because a country will be able to create its own honest money standard that does not use fiat currency, but instead uses the natural resources that the country does have. Resources which several decades ago would not have been able to be a currency. You cannot have timber be a currency unless you create a cryptocurrency where one of those currency coins represents an amount of lumber or whatever else that would be impossible to lug around with you as currency. So with cryptocurrency, it is possible to turn things that could have never been a currency before into a functional currency. And thus, if gold and silver and platinum and palladium and oil and Bitcoin and Litecoin are all controlled by evil countries in the future, a rogue country, a country that wants to be virtuous, a country that wants to be independent, a country that most of the other countries of the world are set against because they're tyrannical and this one country is virtuous, then this one country will be able to create its own cryptocurrency based on whatever natural resources it has. And then the people of that country will be able to exchange their labor for coins of that domestic cryptocurrency, as well as the people of other countries or of multinational corporations that want to do business with that country. Then it would have all the independence and freedom of what Hitler did, that is, a fiat currency system with an honest leader who does it wisely to benefit the people. You could have that, the virtues, you could have the advantages of that, but do it without having to have fiat currency. It would be an honest money system, right? And it would free the country from other countries that control the supply and or hordes of other honest monies like gold and Bitcoin and stuff, right? But such a cryptocurrency, like a cryptocurrency based on timber, backed up by timber, right, would allow that country to make the country independent without the weakness of giving the government the power of being able to print the currency into oblivion to pay for stupid things like war. And another thing that Chomsky does not seem to understand is the issue of power. Chomsky seems to understand that the people are oppressed, but he does not seem to understand that things like democracy are bad because they give people the illusion of power over their masters. This illusion enslaves people because they neglect to fight back. Such deluded people who think that democracy means they are free fail to realize that their controllers break the rules all the time, but they still hold the common people accountable to those same rules. Because of the power of influence and money and the disparity in IQ, the only system that gives the common people even the slightest chance of having a decent life is one in which the people can use the money they want to use, can arm themselves to whatever extent they deem necessary, and can do whatever they want. The elites do whatever they want because they know that they have the money and the lawyers and the political influence and the ability to bribe people in order to get away with it. The money and the lawyers and the power to bribe and the political influence they have, all that allows them to get away with almost anything. Massive environmental regulations that kill shitloads of people, stealing billions and billions of dollars from the people and then getting bailed out. Murdering people. Like the government, corporations or the oligarchs, they do all kinds of horrible things, and they get away with it absolutely with not even the tiniest little punishment in almost all cases. And this is because they have the power, right? But the common people strictly follow the law because they know that the law will come down on them like a hammer if they break it in even the tiniest way, even if only accidentally. So this effectively creates two legal systems, one for the poor and one for the rich. And it deludes the poor people into thinking that there is just one legal system. This prevents people from seeing that everything is all about nothing but naked power. The power of wealth, influence, violence, intelligence, etc. There are many kinds of power, and life is all about power and nothing else. And this is extremely important to understand. If we had an anarcho-capitalist society, then it would probably still be quite unfair and quite full of disparities of wealth and disparities of opportunity, but at least people under an anarcho-capitalist society would recognize the unfairness and would organize to benefit themselves and fight the elites and the elites' power structures when the elites try to set things up in an unfair way, because the people would realize that it's about nothing but power. Right? So when they're being treated unfairly, they just go and they get their guns and they remedy the situation, right? At least the people would have the weapons to attack any corporations that acted too unfairly or dishonestly or cruelly. The people could hold the corporations accountable for their actions. The people could also use whatever money they wanted to, including gold and silver, and would have to do so, and would do so without having to pay much of a price when buying and selling it. And since everyone would use honest money, whether gold or silver or Bitcoin or something else, there would be little fluctuation in the value of money, and thus everyone could save safely instead of taking a risk having to cash in one's gold at a time when the price might be in a plateau or a trough, and thus end up losing out when it skyrockets a year later, such as can happen today. Like you sell your gold because it's been steady at $1,200 for several years while you've had it, and then you sell it because you need to buy a car or whatever, and like a year later it skyrockets into doubles or triples in price, right? That kind of thing can happen today, and does happen. Maybe not over that short of a time span, but over a span of 5 or 10 years, the price of gold might double or triple, right? And then you lost out on all that money because you sold your gold before it doubled or tripled to get that car, right? So that's the kind of crap that happens today. But if we had everybody on honest money and there was no fiat currency, then that would never happen because, everything would just stay the same price. Everything would always be the same price in gold. Everything would always be the same price. I'm talking for decades and decades. It'd be like it'd take the same amount of gold or silver or Bitcoin or cryptocurrency backed by timber to buy 12 eggs, and then 100 years later it costs the same amount in gold or silver or Bitcoin or cryptocurrency backed by timber to buy that same amount of eggs, same amount of money to buy the same amount of eggs. This is how it used to be in America when we were on a sound money system, a bimetallic system, gold and silver as our money. We had that for a long time, and it worked perfectly, right? And it hedged itself or arbitraged itself or whatever. So gold and silver went up a little bit in relation to each other, but then a lot of people, like when silver was undervalued, people would buy silver, and then that would make the price of silver go up and the purchasing power of gold go down. And then when silver was overvalued, people would buy gold. So they were always fluctuating between each other, but they were always pretty much the same. And it took the same amount of gold to buy 12 eggs as it would 100 years later. It took the same exact amount of gold to buy the same exact amount of eggs. So it could be like that again if we put the world back on a sound money system, or we all overthrow the government and we all use whatever sound money we want. There would be many, many, many forms of sound money. Many of them backed by cryptocurrencies, backed by things that could have never been money before, like timber, and then or copper, and then other forms of things like Bitcoin and Litecoin and Zcash, and then other ones like gold and silver. If everybody used various whatever honest monies they wanted, then society would be way, 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 way better, and the price of things would never ever go up. Much of the tyranny that we suffer today is due to the complication of things. Many things have been complicated even though they did not need to be complicated. Simplicity is almost always best because it makes things intelligible to everyone with, let's say, an IQ above 80. Simplicity makes for a less uneven playing field. The intellectual, political, and financial elite making things complicated so as to deceive the people by way of confusing them. Violence is simple. Theft is simple. And when people are stolen from, even if they don't understand how, at least in an anarcho-capitalist society, then those victims of theft will be able to band together and go hunt down and kill the CEO or the trader or whoever else trader, not traitor. I'm talking about some kind of person who's trading, stocks or whatever, right? And he says, oh, buy this financial product, this will be great. But really he knows that it's a con, and maybe it's not, something, because there'd be no laws under anarcho-capitalism, right? So you sign this agreement or whatever, but he knows that the whole thing is way too complicated and that it's got this fine print in there that allows him to screw you, right? So that wouldn't fly. People get away with shit like that today. But, not in the future under anarcho-capitalism, they wouldn't. Everybody would get super pissed off. All the people who get robbed by that financial product band together, and they go hunt him down, and they'd kill him. Or they'd, rob him, or whatever, right? Or they'd cut off his hands and then steal all his money and say, you're lucky we didn't kill you, right? So, these people today, they manage to craftily rob people by making things so complicated that the victims agree to something that they don't realize that they're agreeing to. Right? This fundamental ability of people to resolve issues with violence is absolutely important to preserve. It's critical to preserve. The reason we are so poor and so oppressed today, well, there are many reasons, but one is that because we have allowed the government to gradually take away this right to use violence away from us. We've allowed them to take this right away from us, and so we can't resolve things with violence anymore, and so we are just tyrannized and stolen from more and more and more. You see? If a trader or a CEO knows that he is putting his life in danger by creating a complicated financial product that will allow him to make a lot of money by deceiving a lot of people and essentially robbing them, then he will be far less willing to create such a product, because he knows that if he does it, he'll be putting his life in danger by doing so. It's only because the government backs up such financial shenanigans with violence, in other words, does not let the people use violence to remedy the situation. It's only because the corporations can hide behind our violent, corrupt government that these elites feel safe in creating these viciously crafty financial instruments that allow them to transfer wealth from the common people to the already rich people with superior intellect and superior ability, who nevertheless do not use the intellect for productive purposes, but instead use their intellect to transfer wealth by deceptive but legal means. And the government does not work for the people, or else it would not be allowing these things to happen, right? But the government does not outlaw these things, but merely makes a show of shaming these men when everything goes to hell, all in a corrupt effort to placate the public's wrath. It's just the whole whipping boy thing all over again. Nothing has changed in society. They used to bring out a whipping boy and whip him, so everyone feels placated, right? Like something's been done for it, right, about the problem. Now they just, trot out, Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon and people like this in front of some Senate committee or whatever, and they're like, and then they ask them a bunch of, quote-unquote tough questions, and then, they're all uncomfortable in the seat and they're trying not to, say anything that would incriminate themselves or whatever, and then they make a big show of it, right? But then nothing happens. No one is prosecuted. No monopoly is broken up. Nothing changes. And in fact, they're just given a bailout. It's ridiculous. So nothing has changed. Nothing. I also wanted to address another flaw in Chomsky's thinking. In a video on the YouTube channel called Chomsky's Philosophy, there's a video in the Postmodernism playlist that is called Noam Chomsky, Human Nature 2, and it had a Roman numeral 2. In that video, near the end, Chomsky refutes the idea that human nature is negative or that it is largely negative, and he does so by saying that the argument that his interviewer made was flawed. The interviewer used the argument that a normal person would make, which is that the proof of the evil, or at least the partial evil, of human nature is all around us, or maybe not the proof of the evil, but the proof of that people cannot be good because the world and everyone around them is evil. You see, so this makes it impossible for them to be good, right? Because evil incentivizes more evil. It's a race to the bottom, right? And he said, the interviewer said that the normal person would say that, the proof of evil or whatever is, human nature is all around us. The world today and humanity's history prove themselves. The history of humanity and the world today themselves prove the darkness of human nature. Then Chomsky incorrectly states that you can prove either position with that logic. You can look at history and pull out examples of war and horror and evil and then say that human nature is bad. Or you can look at history and pull out examples of goodness and say that human nature is good. Chomsky basically says that therefore pointing at history or society today does not prove anything. But the interviewer had also said that the common person would say that they would like to act a certain way, but they cannot do so because it's impossible because of human nature being what it is. and, other people being a problem, right? Chomsky is not taking entropy into account. That's Chomsky's problem there. Chomsky is not taking account of the fact that it is easier to build than it is easier to build than destroy. That it's easier to poison than to create and or heal. Chomsky is not taking account of the fact that one bad apple spoils the whole bunch, or one moldy strawberry quickly makes all the other strawberries moldy as well. Like in a package that you buy at the store, right? You leave it in the fridge too long and it gets moldy, then once one gets moldy, it's going to quickly spread and make a lot of the others moldy also, right? You see, this is how it is. One bad apple spoils the whole bunch. Therefore, even if 99 or even 99.9% of people were good, it's not enough, because that 1% or 0.1% of people who are bad will lie and kill and rape and steal and climb to the top of the power pyramid and deceive people into enslaving others for them, all by fooling the soldiers into thinking that they're doing something good, like killing quote-unquote bad people, or enforcing quote-unquote law and order, as if it doesn't matter whether the laws are tyrannical or evil or not, as if they just must be obeyed no matter what. So the common person who makes this argument that they would like to act a certain way, but they cannot because of the way the world is, those common people who make that argument are basically correct. And Chomsky's attempted refutation is not valid because things tend toward evil, toward disorder, toward unhealthy chaos, toward destruction, toward entropy. So we cannot have a good society even if most people are good, because the 1% of us, the evil people, the 1% of us who are evil are ruining things for the rest of us who are good. So human nature's evil is really a huge problem, because it incentivizes evil, because human nature has a whole spectrum. Some people are very virtuous, and some people are sort of good and sort of bad, and some people are largely bad, and some people are pure psychopaths, pure evil. If you have 100 people in a commune, and 99 of them are working their asses off for the good of everyone, and one person is sitting on his ass hardly doing anything, then it only takes that one person not pulling his weight to piss everybody else off and encourage those 99 people to stop working as hard as they were before. It only takes one evil person to cause a lot of problems, but it does not take only one highly virtuous person to cause a lot of good effects. One good person can have an effect, but one evil person can have a much greater effect than one virtuous person can have, because it is generally speaking, because it is easier to do evil than to do good. It's easier to be lazy than to work hard. It is easier to destroy something than to create something. It is easier to make someone feel like shit than it is to make them feel wonderful. So the effect that a highly virtuous person can have is limited, but the effect that an evil person can have is almost boundless. So human nature being what it is, really does prevent people from acting certain ways, and it really does prevent certain economic and governmental and societal setups from being functional. Such as, communism and socialism not working because of human nature. If human nature were purely good, then communism would work perfectly, right? Or socialism or whatever, right? But they don't work because human nature is not purely good, right? Human evil must be accounted for, or else there will always be a disaster. Bitcoin would not work if it trusted its participants. It works because it does not trust its participants. Same thing with society. That's one of Chomsky's main problems. He seems to be extremely naive about human nature. In a video where he talked about nonviolence, he basically said that there's no other option other than nonviolence. He said in one video that the Second Amendment was for the militias that people had to be part of, and the Second Amendment was for dealing with Indians, and the Second Amendment was for keeping slaves in line. But I find this to be a slightly ridiculous argument, because most people did not own slaves, and yet the Second Amendment protected everyone's right to own a gun. And, Indians weren't necessarily going to be forever, and, we do have a military, so it's like, why should, not that he was necessarily advocating for the abolishment of the Second Amendment in that video, but I wouldn't be surprised if he does, but, that would mean that we should abolish why would you have police and a military that have guns and not let the people have guns? Because then you can be tyrannically oppressed even worse, right? And yet, if you don't have police and you don't have a military, then the people need guns more than ever, right? So either way, the people should be armed, and the people should be armed to the teeth. He said in another video, Chomsky did, that violence does not work because if you bring a gun to a protest or whatever, then the opposition, the government's forces, like the police or the National Guard, will bring rifles. And if you bring rifles, the government will bring tanks. And if the people bring tanks, then the government will use nukes. And Chomsky's conclusion is that therefore the government will always win if you try to use force against it, because force is the government's prime. It's forte. You know, that's the government's thing. So you can never beat the government with force. This is Chomsky's idea, right? So again, this argument strikes me as ridiculous as well. The people have the numbers, which is what has allowed the people to overthrow tyrannical rulers over and over again throughout all of history. So while the government may have superior firepower, the government does not have superior numbers. The people could bomb the treads of the tanks. The people could plug up the barrels of the tanks. You know, there's probably a lot more things that the people could do to stop more advanced weaponry as well, you know, that the government might bring against people. So the government could bring more advanced weaponry, but that doesn't mean that the government would win in a battle of force between the American government and the people. Not at all. You know, look at Afghanistan. You know, Afghanistan has kept America, the greatest empire the world has ever seen, embroiled in a war that America just cannot seem to win. You know, 15 years later, they still can't win the fucking war. It's ridiculous. Actually, it's more than 15 years later now, isn't it? Like 17 years later or something? You know, they have crappy guns, AK-47s, which have bad accuracy, although they do not jam as easily, so it's sort of a trade-off. But the point remains that America has the money and the superior weaponry, and yet America still cannot win. This is how it is. It is impossible to win against a foe who refuses to give up. The American public could easily overthrow the government, even if the government wanted to use the full might of the police, the National Guard, the U.S. military, and everything else it has against the American public. The public could still easily win, because we have the bullets, and a tank is worthless once a guy driving it is dead, you know? And then you just take the tank, and now you have a tank against the other tanks. You see? And any buildings that are destroyed are just buildings that the U.S. will have to try to rebuild. And any insurgent Americans who are killed are just fewer taxpayers to pay for that rebuilding and to pay for the military arms that the government is using. And any women or children killed are just more martyrs to the cause, who will cause even more Americans to join the Revolutionary War against the U.S. government. And any tank drivers killed, like I said, any tank drivers killed leave behind tanks which are now in the revolutionary side's hands, which can then be turned against the tanks still run by the government. We can and we will win against the government. All it takes is a bit of stockpiling of weapons and bullets and the balls to fight for as many years as it takes, even if it takes, you know, decades to win. I don't think it definitely would not take decades to win, although it depends how many people we have on our side, right? You know, if we have, 50 million people on our side willing to fight and die to overthrow the government, easy win, right? But if we only have, 1 million people fighting the government, maybe we could win, but it would be hard, right? And it might take years or decades, right? But, like I said, the government would probably end up killing women and children too, especially if we're really, really fanatical. And then, in our fighting, and they have to, bomb whole buildings to kill us, then, every woman and child killed has relatives, and all those relatives are going to join the fight against the government, you see? So we can absolutely win against the government. The people can win by wearing the government down, because the government is a parasite that feeds on the people. Just like how men can conquer women by withdrawing provision and procreation and attention and approval and all the rest of it, the public can conquer the government by withdrawing the lifeblood of taxes, the lifeblood of consent, the lifeblood of trust. When the people stop trusting the government en masse and stop consenting to obey the government en masse, and when the people stop paying taxes en masse, then the government will have no choice but to try to convince the people to compromise with it. But all we have to do is continue to refuse to compromise, and government will utterly cave and will become our bitch. And that's how it's supposed to be. The government is supposed to be completely at the mercy of the people. The government is supposed to be scared to death of the public. The government is supposed to be cravenly obedient to the public. Chomsky's idea that violence does not work is preposterous. Chomsky's idea that our only option is nonviolence, and that if that doesn't work, then we're doomed, is a terrible idea. He did not mention the petrodollar as the reason we went into Iraq either. The second time, that is, under Bush Jr. It's really astonishing to see how someone so brilliant as Chomsky can be so idiotic. I think he's just naive, but it's also possible that he's controlled opposition. After all, he does seem to check all the boxes of someone who would be controlled opposition. Pro-fiat currency, not thinking that the petrodollar is relevant, or seemingly. He thinks violence is entirely ineffective and believes that non-violent resistance is humanity's only hope. So, I don't know, I'm kind of on the fence when it comes to the topic of whether Chomsky is controlled opposition or not, but I lean toward thinking that he's not controlled opposition. Partially because he talks about some stuff that the government does not seem to want people to talk about, such as how evil Israel's behavior toward the Palestinians is, and how we are under the control of the corporate powers, which control the government and profit from the government, at our expense no less. This has been Redshift. I think this is about all I had to say in this video. I hope you liked it. Hit the thumbs up button if you did. Hit the thumbs down button if you hated it. Peace, trucks.